This month's tutorial is a recording of a discussion between myself and Dr. Ashley Rogers on the subject of ethics and impact. This is a fascinating topic that interconnects with so many other conversations that are currently live in the HE sector, not least equity and diversity and inclusion, decolonization, research culture, the concept of fairness. I think this is a fascinating subject. But please don't expect definite answers or a how-to from this session. It's not that easy, impact and ethics, but I do hope that our chat will spark some thoughts about your own engagement practice. Enjoy. So today I'm joined by Dr. Ashley Rogers. Ashley is an ethnographic researcher and lecturer in criminology at the University of Stirling, focusing on social justice and crimes of the powerful. Ashley completed her ESRC-funded socio-legal PhD in December 2017, which explored the experiences of women victims of violence in Bolivia and the challenges they face when accessing justice. She spent 1 year conducting ethnographic fieldwork in La Paz with women's groups, non-governmental organizations, and state bodies. In particular, her research focused on the implementation of Law 348 to guarantee women a life free from violence and women's legal consciousness and subjectivity. This has also led to work exploring femicide and law. Ashley also researches in the areas of asylum and refugee rights, and most recently has begun work in the area of extreme weather events and the value of Indigenous or local knowledges. So welcome, Ashley, to this tutorial, delivered for the first time as an audio recording, sort of a precursor to a podcast series we're hoping to do. And the topic this month is the topic of impact and ethics. Now, I must admit, I've been very hesitant in covering this as a topic because I think it is potentially, it's a potentially vast topic, and it's not something that I necessarily feel in any way expert or well informed on. So I thought that one of the best ways of tackling this would be to actually have a guest speaker. So when I met Ashley at the Stirling Crucible in May 2023, and we started talking, I thought she would be perfect to come along and have a chat with me, which I hope you'll find informative, and to talk about the topic of impact and ethics even. So welcome, Ashley, and thank you very much for agreeing to be our first guest on our, hopefully, sort of podcast series. Ashley, let's begin by you telling us a bit about yourself and your research, and I think most importantly, the sort of the driver for you, the passion that sits behind the research that you do in the areas in which you research.
Okay, well, thank you very much for having me on to discuss this. It's funny that you say it's something you've often avoided, because only very recently have I begun to talk about this more openly myself, because there's often a lot of discomfort for people, I think, around ethics. Either there is or there isn't. They sail through and don't think about it too much, or they do. So in terms of me, I actually became involved in academia in 2009 as a teaching assistant and a research assistant. I was actually doing my master's in human rights and international politics in Glasgow at the time, and also doing some work at the Refugee Council and a few other precarious positions. A few years later, I decided that I wanted to pursue a PhD. I actually wanted to research, it began with the topic, I wanted to do research in Bolivia on women's legal subjectivity, violence against women, the combination between individual rights and collective rights. That was really fascinating at a time for me when they were producing a new constitution. I'd always been quite intrigued at how you develop a new constitution. It seems like starting afresh. So my first piece of research as a master's student focused on Bolivia, but did not involve me interacting with anyone in person. So an ethics form, if you like, was very short in that case. But I did go on to do a PhD, which came with it another master's. So I was funded to do a second one, a glutton for punishment, some might say. But I was actually really excited about it. And I actually went back to the sort of 1500s Latin America to explore how legal subjects were developed through law and through legal cases. So particularly Indigenous peoples and Indigenous groups? How were they presented and represented through law? I saw that as a bit of groundwork, I suppose, for my PhD, but the PhD was far more immersive, I guess, than anything I had ever done before, and did involve me living, as you've mentioned, in La Paz for 12 months. So I was fully immersed in the field. I did participant observation. I interviewed. The sort of hanging out, as people might say, that the spending time with people and having all of those sorts of informal interactions as well. I have since then continued with other interests that I had prior to that, and from when I was at the Refugee Council. So I've continued to do work on unaccompanied asylum seeking children, refugee and asylum seeking families. And then I suppose a growing interest for me has always been the environment and the impact that has on all of these issues, really. But I did, as an undergraduate, start university doing environmental science. I very quickly realised up a mountain somewhere, gathering soil samples, that it wasn't quite for me. But I do appear to have gone a little bit full circle. So I'm back to trying to bring together these kinds of issues. So issues around forced migration, around violence, in particular men's violence against women, and also the environment and climate change. So while they seem quite separate, they're quite intricately linked. A lot of complexities and challenges, and really underpinning it for me has always been a real sense of social justice. I am a criminologist, but for me it's not so much about criminal justice as would be defined by states or people in positions of power, but instead about the everyday justice and the well-being of people in their everyday lives.
Okay. Well, thank you for that, Ashley. And it's clear that, you are passionate about it and that you are coming at this from that real sort of perspective of wanting your research to address questions, I suppose, around fairness and around, as you say, sort of social justice, which already puts you, I think, in a slightly sort of different perspective to the range of researchers that we work with. You are in quite a privileged position in terms of the access, I would say, that you get to the people that you work with. And given that you tend to work in really close proximity as a sort of ethnographic researcher, and that's in terms of how you approach your sort of research methodologies, how do you think about and ensure
and how you engage with continued consent rather than, for example, just getting consent at the beginning? And that's an example of something I try to avoid doing. I get consent at the beginning. I don't ask anyone to sign anything, and there are occasions that I don't ask anyone to sign anything at all. But we check consent throughout. And actually at the end, once people's words are out there, only then can they really consent to you having those words, because beforehand they don't know what you're going to ask them. They don't know what they're going to say. They've not processed that information, and it's not been a sort of dialogical experience yet. So only, I feel, once their words are out into that space, can they say, yeah, it's okay for you to have them, because you don't have them. They're never yours. So that's one, I suppose, element of it, alongside your, thinking about your positionality and making sure that that's not something that's quite tokenistic. You've added it into an ethics form because it's something you should think about. No, actually, it's something you really, really should be thinking about. And it's an embodied experience. And so you encounter that in the practicalities. The third layer, I think, it's more philosophical, around ethics and morality and values and beliefs. And there's very little space for that. There's almost no space for that in an ethics form. And you could probably produce something extremely lengthy for those on the ethics committee. But it's also something people don't talk about a lot. And there's not a lot of space in journal articles. If you are highlighting your results of a research project, you mentioned you had ethical clearance, but unless it's an article specifically about positionality or ethics, there isn't really space to engage with how researchers approach this subject. So I suppose for me, that's how I approach all of my research, but it's how I try to ensure that ethics is central, probably more than anything else, all the way throughout my research, is thinking of it in those three ways.
I'm gonna that's really fascinating. And what I want to draw you on is that third level, the sort of the ethics and the morality and the beliefs, which are so individual and so and subjective in relation to how you're working and who you're working with. So I hope it's not too tricky a question, but can you give me an example of that at play for you? Of where you've kind of got down to that third level, because I totally understand. I love, your concept around continual consent, and actually you need to keep rechecking that. I think that's a great way to approach the concept of consent, because I think it's very easy just to go, yeah, I've received consent and I'm all good to go, and not reference back on that. So that reflexivity is important. But this sort of third layer of reflexivity that you're talking about here, this much deeper layer, let's delve into that a bit and tell me a bit more about what that means to you, hopefully maybe with an example as well.
For me, it's probably related to the idea that when you're doing research, you are producing knowledge and hopefully co-producing that knowledge. And that's something, we can also talk about. But it really comes down to, I suppose, a form of epistemic justice, or at least avoiding epistemic injustices.
Justice, yeah.
Because all of that is about who you are and how you think about and design your research topic. It's the teams that you and the people that you choose to work with. And there are potentially also people that you avoid working with. And it's about really delving down into those subjectivities and thinking, who am I as a researcher? Who do I want to be? Because there are competing interests in academia, and you've got to keep a hold, I think, of yourself within all of that. It's very individualized system. It's very easy to enter into a game playing sort of way, but fundamentally, I think it's about, why are you doing this piece of research and what do you want to come out of it? And knowing that as an academic, you are in a very privileged position to be someone who will be producing knowledge. You will write about these subjects, you will present and represent peoples. How will you do that? And so one example, I actually have many examples of this, but one of them was thinking about how I represented the women that I worked with in Bolivia. The stories and the narratives that I gathered over that year, and spending time with women and taking part in protests and marches on the street and speaking to the police and government, it was really quite empowering. And as a woman, it was quite, I think, inspirational and empowering to see. And that was the feeling that I had. But that feeling, I struggled to portray in the writing. And so I started to wonder, what narrative am I producing here in this ethnography? Because an ethnography is something you do, but it's also something you produce. So what is the narrative I'm creating, and does it accurately reflect the realities of the women that I've spent my time with? So partly I became, perhaps through my own interests and, in the philosophical side and the socio-legal side, drawn into more of that. And the more that I did, the more that my way of thinking about the world seemed to conflict with the feeling that I had when I worked with the women. Feelings of power and strength and fighting. But that didn't come through in my writing. The women weren't being presented as fighters, as strong, as empowered, as agents of change. They were coming across as victims and vulnerable and hopeless, and there was elements of that absolutely to their stories, but that also wasn't how they wanted to be presented. And so I was conflicted there.
And can I ask, why do you think that was, that you were having this sort of experience and experiencing it differently, but yet somehow once you started to write it, it was once it was on the page and those words came out, it was somehow different. Could you, and this is probably a really tricky question, but what do you think was going on there?
I think the challenge exists, and it's that broader conflict around the dominant structures of society and how we work within those. So to what extent do we have agency? And so a lot of it's, I guess, about people's own philosophical positions on on life.
Yeah.
And is our life determined for us by dominant structures? And those can be like, patriarchy, and in the context of Latin America, machismo, and so on. And to what extent can we find paths within that system and carve them out for ourselves? So some of it for me feels like a real challenge. But the other challenge, I think, came from my positionality as a white Scottish woman working in the global south. Or what if we, little air
I think,
quotes there, global south.
is it the larger majority now, we say, or the
Yeah,
world?
so we often
Yeah,
say,
is that
yeah, so I, would often say the majority world. We are
the
the minority
majority
world
world?
and
Yeah.
the majority world. And so even discussions around those concepts and how we mobilize those concepts. I didn't think about it as much before I went to Bolivia. And I think it was because once I received funding, that was it. I'm doing the project. And then you start to read more and you engage more with the topic. And then I started to feel a bit uncomfortable, but I still had to go. I was doing the research. And when I was there, I encountered that kind of uncomfortable feeling a few times. And given the topic that I was doing, I actually encountered it more from men than I did women. Uh, Men would often say, why are you coming here to explore violence against women? And I thought, what is the you? What's loaded in the you? Is it
Yeah.
you white? Is it you a woman? Is it you academic? What's all
Yeah.
encapsulated there? And in hindsight, I wish I'd pressed a little bit more. But it just touched on that tiny part of me that I was trying to suppress for so long, the feeling of being uncomfortable about my positionality given what I was researching. I spoke about this with women that I was working with, and they sort of trivialized it in a way. But of course, doing lots of reading about positionality and ethics and issues around impact and reciprocity and
Mm.
all of that was still there. Women saying, but we think this is great that, someone has acknowledged that there's an issue here and that we have this new legal framework. But all of the academia, if you like, the books, the philosophical side of ethics, I couldn't escape that. It's as if it was chasing me everywhere.
Yeah.
Um, and I wasn't friends with it. I've become friends with it now, but I wasn't friends with it at the time, because you are trying to be, particularly when you're doing your PhD, you're trying to also be that confident researcher who knows what they're doing,
Yeah.
who has all their ducks in a row. They're not waddling off in different directions. They're confident. They are presenting that particular self at the time.
So let me ask you the question then. How did you make friends with it? What was the process that you have gone through?
So I completed my PhD by taking an extra year unfunded. I sometimes talk about this in a way that suggests that I was being strategic about my career and making sure I was picking up other opportunities. And that isn't, that's I'm not lying, but it's not the full story. And the full story really is that I needed that space when I came back, because I didn't feel like I could write in a way that best represented the women that I worked with and the stories that I was told and their lived realities. And it meant that I fell to writing the easier chapters, if you like, going back to literature review, going back to methodology. I love a methodology chapter. So writing that, and I pushed and pushed and pushed aside a return to the data.
Right.
And a lot of that was because the philosophical, ethical, scary person that had been following me around that whole entire year had caught up with me on the plane. And it really was on the plane. I had 3 plane journeys back to Scotland, and they were emotional. They were, for lots of reasons. You're leaving lots of people that you have come to appreciate and love as friends and family often. And you're coming back to write. And in order to write, I think you have to revisit the philosophical aspects of your ethics and your morality and what you did. And we don't always necessarily do everything the way that we may have wanted to, or when we reflect and with hindsight that we wish we had. And I think that's what caught up with me. And so the extra time in my PhD, reading more. At the beginning, I'll be honest, it was painful. And that's also, filled with privilege and white guilt and all of those other things. So, it's a privilege to, wallow in it. But I needed to really go through all of that and talk about it more openly with people, which in turn makes other people uncomfortable. But seeing other people uncomfortable, ethically is not something I would strive for. But in this instance, it was good. It was good to see that I wasn't alone in this thinking, and that what I was thinking was real. And that in actual fact, Indigenous scholars and scholars across the world had been talking and thinking about this, and I had never really entered into or had access to those spaces before.
Because
And so
this
I'm still,
connects up. Oh,
yeah, sorry.
I was going to say, so this connects up with the whole decolonization conversation and all of those things, which it was interesting the way you've described it, because you've come to that rather than coming at it, from reading the literature. You've come at it from a personal realization and then found, oh, this is not a conversation I'm having on my own. It fits into a bigger sort of, a bigger conversation that is a global conversation.
Yeah. And I think, it's not to say that I didn't know that a lot of that literature is excellent. And it's not to say that I didn't know that I didn't realize it existed prior to the PhD. I guess I did, but I hadn't engaged with it in a way that I wish in hindsight I had. And had I may not have done that PhD at all.
Oh, okay. That's interesting.
Little revelation. But yes, I may not have done that particular PhD. I may have. I'm not sure. I'm not sure if I went back in time and I read it again, how I would approach the application for funding, but also the application at the time for funding when I did my PhD. It wasn't something that you could perhaps use more participatory sort of action research or methods in by saying, I'm going to do something, but I'm not quite sure exactly what it is, and I'm not going to define it yet. But if you just trust me, and give me the money, then we'll figure it out.
Yeah.
And again, that's the sort of structures, and I'm not blaming those for the way that I did things, but I certainly, in hindsight, wish that I had perhaps pushed more to do it a bit differently.
I think that's in terms of having the space to reflect on that and reflect on that growth in your own knowledge and understanding. Not that you've necessarily got a clear answer as to how you might have done it differently, but to maybe recognize that, I think that's quite a place to come to, that you may have approached that in a different way. But at the same time, I think there's also an element of, you work with the knowledge structures that you have around you at the time, and what's really important in this is the growth and the recognition that it can be different. So I'm going to take us on a slightly different tack now, because we've talked very closely sort of about your research. And I think what I'm also interested in is to get your thoughts and views in relation to impact as framed by the ref. Because you and I, when we were chatting about this in the build up to this, we had quite an interesting conversation about sort of impact of the ref, which I think a lot of people would relate to, and it's something that I recognized. It's interesting for me talking to you because you are from that generation really of researchers that are now coming up that have grown up with impact, right? You are not, it is something that has been talked about that you, I think, instinctively understand. That's always the impression I get when I work with sort of early career researchers, that you will instinctively understand the concept of impact. But let's explore a little bit impact and how it is characterized and framed for the purposes of the research excellence framework. What for you are some of the challenges that sit really squarely with that sort of framing of impact and its association with the research excellence framework?
So for me, I mean, if we go straight, I'll sort of work backwards, I guess. But if we go straight for a notion of an impact case study, which is so central to ref submissions, I suppose when it was first established, that the idea was to ensure that there was more flexibility and space for creativity and storytelling about the impacts that people's research was having on the communities that they were studying, that they were working with. And what it feels like it's perhaps become is a more controlled narrative, that over time you start to realize what works, how things are rated. So we start to sort of quantify and measure the success of the impact. And those often aren't by standards of the communities that we are working with. And so it starts to feel like the intention of it and the idea and the principles were around ensuring that when people are doing research and when research councils and bodies are funding researchers, that what they're actually doing is something meaningful, and that's a big part of, for me, impact, something that's meaningful. But that meaning is almost being defined in that top-down way again, and I suppose sometimes it's a cycle. You maybe have to get to that point to say, okay, we need to rethink this again and pull back. And then there'll be the standards set again, and it'll go back to that. And then we need those voices to say, actually, let's pull this back again and revisit what we mean by impact in an impact case study, and how we're measuring it, and who gets to decide what is a meaningful contribution or impact or change in a society. So I suppose that's a really big, a really big one to start with.
You can see my face as I do that. So as you were saying that, Ashley, I was getting kind of goosebumps, which sounds bizarre, but so I do have a slightly problematic relationship with the ref. And I think I say this to lots of people, which is ridiculous, because what I do and my ending up in this space talking about impact wouldn't have come about without that first ref, in which I just happened to be in the right place at the right time and thought I kind of understood it. it is both a driver, because I think there's lots of positive elements that have come out of, what they call the impact agenda, of which the ref has really driven. There are positives there, and I see them in the ways in which people do think about the meaning of the research. They do think about the change it might have. That I can sit down with academics who don't really get the opportunity to talk about what they've done, and watch them really recognize that they've done some amazing positive stuff, and help them see that and reflect on that. So those bits bring me joy. And then there are the elements that you have just outlined around the restrictiveness, the fact that you create narratives in a certain way. And hey, I peddle this, I tell people how to do these things. But what really excited me and gave me goosebumps as you were talking was this idea of how is it possible to, how can we involve the more sort of nuanced community aspects of what success looks like? Is there a way, I absolutely think that narrative needs to be challenged, that it currently is, that it needs to be top down. I'm not quite sure how it's going to be done. I think there is a potential in what they're currently doing with some of the changes that are being proposed to the next ref. I would love to have somebody like you contributing as part of that consultation to start challenging that narrative. And we have people like Gemma Derrick in Bristol, who's doing the hidden ref. Have you heard of that?
No, I haven't heard of
the hidden ref is super exciting, and I will send you a link to it after this, and I'll make sure it's a link as part of this sort of tutorial as well, where they are doing what you're talking about. So trying to challenge the hero narrative of the impact case study, and actually bring other voices into it, talk about the communities that were involved. So if we took your Bolivia case study, for example, and framed it through the hidden ref, it would actually be a story about those women and their journey, and what they have contributed, and their contribution to your research, and the fact that your research, you are not the crafter of all of that knowledge. It's a really exciting concept. Anyway, I see I'm getting ridiculously excited here, aren't I?
But that's it. It's exactly about challenging, because the problem for me, certainly, and maybe it doesn't, I can't imagine it not existing for anyone in the research. But for instance, recent work that I've done in Zimbabwe, for example, the best impact and the best change and everything else that might come from it, the legacies of it, would really be where my name is never mentioned again. I mean, the university would say, oh, no, we want Ashley Rogers everywhere. I don't. And that's not why I started doing that piece of research either. And in fact, spending time, that piece of research was around extreme weather events in Zimbabwe, and in particular Cyclone Idai that hit in 2019. And it was the effects on communities, and how could we support communities post-disaster. And for me, a big focus was also on being able to predict some of these extreme weather events, and focusing on and recognizing and valuing, as it should be, Indigenous and local knowledges. And so a lot of the communities, the feedback that we got was that actually something that was really great from this research was that we encouraged conversations within the communities around Indigenous knowledges, and knowledges that, one, a lot of people thought no one cared about anymore. Two, they weren't really being passed on and shared in the same way through generations that they had before, and that storytelling. But they said, we'll continue these stories, that you've reignited something in our community to carry on with these discussions. That, for me, is wonderful. It's hard. It's not necessarily tangible. I'd have to ask them to document
a testimonial, please, is what you'd have to ask.
Yes. Again, I suppose that's another challenge of the ref in that broader structure, is the gathering of that evidence. And I think that was something that, for me, when you did the Stirling Crucible, I felt like that hit me really hard, actually, when there was talk about ref case studies. And I thought, oh, wait a minute, you would have to gather evidence. I'm in Scotland. Everyone else that I work with, my other colleagues, everyone, are all in Zimbabwe, and they don't have the ref, or, their focus actually is on real impacts in the
Yeah.
communities. And I thought, well, how on earth would you even gather any of that data? And how on earth do you, as you mentioned about the hero, so how do you even attribute it to yourself? And I don't want to attribute it to myself. And that's part of it, because part of, for me, the philosophy of the ethics and morality and the beliefs and the values is not around me as an individual. And all of my research is on the importance of the collectivities and the
Yeah.
social justice, that all of a sudden I have to do in my mind what is a real stretch and shift in order to what I would then see as just play that game, to do that thing
Yeah.
for the institution, when in the background I'm doing all the things that I really want to be able to do and I'm striving to do for the communities. And so for me, as much as they are as one, they don't often feel as one, because there's all of those philosophical tensions, actually, I think, between the two.
Yeah, I mean, and I don't, as I said to you when we first started coming onto this, there's no easy answers here. You're not going to get from this podcast, dear listeners, some sort of easy answer to all of this, because I don't think it really exists. But I think that whole conversation that you're talking about, I have seen many researchers that I've worked with grapple with the same question. And I have grappled with that question, but I've had to then go, okay, let's find a way around this for you. Okay. Because we do have to attribute it to you in your work. Now, I do think that, again, I think we may have an opportunity at this juncture in time with the review of the research action frameworks that's happening with the FRAP that's come out, to potentially influence some of that. Because actually, why shouldn't there be a case study that you can cite and accredit all of those people that you've worked with in Zimbabwe to the impact that you're going to put out there, that it isn't just about the university. Now, I know the entire structure of the REF is about measuring the institution and the research quality in the institution, so therefore it would go against that very sort of baseline of it. But it's a very, I think it's a challenge worth throwing into the mix, because I think the discomfort you talk about is commonplace with that hero narrative that happens in impact case studies, and the attribution that's required to what's there. It's, as I say, I'm not sure there's any easy answer to it, but I think having the conversation and throwing it at people and having it, people mull that over is one of the key things that we can do at present.
And again, it comes back to that being uncomfortable. Nobody wants to make themselves feel uncomfortable, but especially in some of that work in relation to Zimbabwe. There's layers there as well about colonialism and the epistemic injustices that would exist there. And for me, that again comes back to that third that third aspect of ethics.
Well, I mean, there's a whole conversation here, isn't there, about sort of white global north researchers and working in the south, and so many layers. I remember I had a conversation with Mark Reed a little while ago now, when he did an article about 6 months ago, which was one of the things that's really sort of set this particular hair in my head, sort of going around and thinking about impact and ethics. It was something that was rather dormant. So thank you for that, Mark, if you ever listen to this, for getting that conversation going in my head. So what I wanted to sort of talk about now was actually as part of the research for us having a chat with this. As I said, I felt a little bit uncomfortable. So I started seeing what was out there, and I came across a project by Oxford University via the LSE Impact blog, which is a great resource if you're not aware of it. I think it's something we talk about here a lot in Impact Integrators, so a lot of you should have checked that out at some point. But this is a project being led by Oxford University. It's called the Responsible Knowledge Exchange, Engagement and Impact Project. Bit of a mouthful. And it's led by Professor Elise Oansia. I've probably messed up your name there. Apologies if I have. Eileen Marshall-Brown and Juliet Scott Barrett. And they have had some funding, I think, from Wellcome, Impact Acceleration Accounts, things of that nature. And they've they've been asking this question around how do you ethically engage? What are the principles that sit behind that? And through a series of workshops, etc., they've come up with these 6 principles for understanding and identifying responsible KE and engagement. And these are integrity and ethics, equity, diversity and inclusion, sustainability and reciprocity. Got that right? Contextual sensitivity, sharing and openness, support and recognition. I think, Ashley, you had a read of that as well. I found it a really nice frame. I wondered what your how did it resonate with you?
So for me, I agree. It's a really nice framework. I probably, as do the researchers themselves, but see all of them just intertwined. So that neat little framework is much more fuzzy, and everything sort of drips into everything else, and that's also the way it should be.
Yeah.
But I would very much agree. And there's obviously a few of those that they did highlight are rarely discussed. And again, I think a lot of it comes down to people being uncomfortable.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about one of those, because one of the ones that struck me as I was reading it, I mean, you could buy into most of those, was the one about reciprocity and sustainability. And that really struck me because actually it reminded me of a conversation I had, 16, 17, 18 years ago at the very start of my career, working with research with a wonderful academic from Nottingham Trent University. And she was the first academic I ever spoke to who talked about reciprocity and the importance of it. But it's not something I come across very often, right? At all. So in terms of thinking about those topics of sustainability and reciprocity, which have been identified as something that doesn't really happen. And by the way, just to make it clear, this is described as the meaningful and lasting benefits to the communities involved and the avoidance of negative externalities or environmental sustainability. I think, are these issues that you think about as part of your research? How do they apply to the work that you do?
So now I definitely think about them a lot more, and particularly the word sustainability, because some of my research, as I mentioned about Zimbabwe, still continues to be. I do it differently than I approach the PhD, right enough, but it often involves, if we're even thinking about sustainability in the sense of traveling and your carbon footprint, and what does that mean, but how do you balance that with understanding the contexts and learning about people and hearing for yourself people's stories, and then I suppose there's the question of, are you the right person to be doing that? So if we're thinking about the sustainability of the research, I think that also links to funders, and how they are thinking about the impact, but also how they have designed the funding to begin with. So is the funding, and is any follow-on funding, is it contingent on researchers having someone based in the UK on the team? And in actual fact, that's really probably how I ended up involved in this project on Zimbabwe. I'm on the project, a different project with some of those researchers. And you form that relationship with people that you're researching with. And then this other project came up and they asked me to be part of it. But they would also, they shouldn't have needed to, really. When we really think about it, they shouldn't have needed to ask someone else. And so I think for me, the sustainability of, or the legacies of the impact and the meaning that it has on communities could go further if we recognize perhaps some of these practices in the way that funding is distributed as sometimes forms of epistemic injustice. Because and part of it might very well be, and I just don't know much about the funding structures. Some of it might just be legally you need to have someone at a UK institute. I'm not sure, but for me, there's something about that construction of knowledge. Why does it need, if we are, and you mentioned decolonization before, and and who knows what that really means in practice. Universities use it a lot, but But if we really want to be doing that, then we have to decenter the UK scholar, I think, in some of the funding. And that's challenging to say too, because I am a UK researcher as well, and this is in my career, and again, that's also challenging thing to say, because what you're hoping for is that you have, again, we're talking about equity, diversity, and inclusion. You hope you have that at universities across the UK in order to deal with some of that, and well, we don't.
No.
So it's a sustainability for me. There lots of different layers to it, sort of practical aspects of travel and international travel, and what does that do in terms of learning more and contextualizing and about your team and sharing and openness, and but then there's also the follow-ons from research projects too, and how and what that money goes to.
Yeah. And what about the sort of the reciprocity, though, the sense of the give and take?
I think that's a really, really tricky one. I actually had a conversation with my participants in Bolivia about it, because, and obviously I'd spent a long time with these women. A lot of them become friends. I realised lots of people have that whole issue around friends and research participants, and there's a line and you don't cross it. I don't know. Maybe that's also a personal thing. I find that very difficult, because you develop, you develop relationships and you care for people. So I I remember the conversation. I can remember everything about where I was sitting, and because it was uncomfortable. And I said, I just feel like I'm going to go home and I'm going to get a PhD out of this, potentially, if I pass.
Yeah.
I'm going to get a PhD out of this, and I don't think I'm going to be able to change anything here, because I've already encountered the different layers of bureaucracy and challenge and everything else. I've seen them now firsthand myself, and I don't think I'm going to have any impact on anything. And for lots of the women, they were like, but actually you're having an impact on us, and this is what this means to us, and here's how we've been able to share. And again, there was challenges with that too, but I couldn't see something tangible in terms of reciprocity. And I guess that's what I've always felt uncomfortable with too. And I used to do perhaps small acts, I guess. Looking back, I can see them as kind of small acts of reciprocity, more on a perhaps more individual level. So I would look after kids if they needed to go to work, or they had job interviews, or and I developed those relationships with their families in order for them to feel comfortable enough for me to do that. I volunteered, and learned how to do certain specific things at Women's Centre, and helped out there. I contributed to events planning and organisation. It was something I used to do in a previous job, and that I love. And so I used to sort of do a lot of that, sometimes contribute sort of pockets of money. I took photographs for things, but they were small acts, because I didn't feel like there was something in terms of reciprocity that as time went on, I started to feel smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller as a PhD student at that time, to contribute. I didn't feel there was anything I could do, and no one had ever spoken to me about it either.
So I want to challenge you on that, actually, because I think those little individual acts are actually quite meaningful. And I think that you have to recognize the limitations of your power, either as a PhD student or even as an academic. Actually, power in that academic role to actually change things is often something that is built up over time and over connections. And, it might be that you're in a position to actually change things in another 5, 6, 10 years' time, when you have built your own social power, if that makes sense. So I would challenge you on that. I think those small acts are really key in the concept of reciprocity, that it doesn't have to be formalized and big, right? Don't fall into the trap of believing impact has to be big and formal, as I always say. Those little acts I think are really key. And I think it's about, for me, the concept of reciprocity is about entering into relationships or into research relationships in which you as the researcher are not just extracting, and that you are looking to find ways of giving back to the individuals, communities, or companies or whomever that are allowing you access, that are giving you, especially where there's an imbalance in power like that. So I actually think the things that you have described to me, which you call as very small acts, and which on the surface appear to be, actually demonstrate a really high level of respect for those individuals from yourself, of humanity, of understanding, and the level of trust that they had with you. So I don't think they are small. And I actually think that for people listening to this podcast, if they're trying to tackle this on their own, or as as part of their research, thinking of the small ways in which you can help, I think is a really fantastic starting point, and adds so much value to on a human level to what you're doing. So I don't know, maybe I'm being far too apple pie about that whole, in the way I view it, but actually I think what you did was really important and quite key. And I think it's sometimes all you can do are those little things.
Yeah, I think that's what I felt at the time. That was really all I could do. But then you're torn, because why you do, or why lots of people, certainly lots of people that I would consider my friends in academia, you share that strive for change, and that's why you do research. You want to change something, and you want it yesterday,
Yeah.
you want to be able to see it and feel it, and ensure that for people. But you mentioned about starting at those small acts, and in actual fact that's where I think ethically lots of research should just begin, rather than that kind of extractive industry that we can fall into.
Yeah.
And that research in Zimbabwe, for example, I'd obviously got to know the other researchers really well, and we had the opportunity for follow-on funding that was impact related.
Yeah.
And it was just to take forward any activities that you weren't able to do perhaps during the, I don't want to say the word COVID, but there it is, I've said it.
Yeah.
during that time, anything, things that you couldn't do. Um, and it had to be led by someone in the UK.
Yeah.
And we had a conversation, and the first thing I said was, what do you think, and what do you think the communities at that point, because you're most in contact with them, what would they want us to be doing in this project? And then that's what we'll do, rather than what I was thinking might be the cool thing to do, because academically or philosophically I'm really interested in this, exploring this in more depth. But actually, what would be meaningful to you? What do you want me to do? And then we'll do that.
And that goes back to something you said to me before about learning to listen, but learning to be the person in the room with the least knowledge, I think was how you put it, or accepting that.
Yeah. And that's really difficult, I think, because in academia, because it's quite individualized, particularly in that research, doing your teaching and doing all of that feels like a collective activity. And then doing your research, everyone has their own pockets of research, and you present on it and you talk about it, and you have to talk about it in a particular way that presents a particular confident you. But I think you have to pull back on that. You have to let go. You have to be, if it makes you feel vulnerable, then you have to feel vulnerable. And you have to give all of that up, because in actual fact, you really are. That's why you're in it. That's why you're doing this. You're learning. And so you have to position yourself as a learner. And sometimes I sort of think about it as a learner who's perhaps in a privileged position to have access to funding that may help people.
Yeah.
If it's set up that way, is there a way that I can work with people that means that I'm not extracting from them, but I'm in some way still contributing, but that they also have opportunities to have access funds to explore these. So, Indigenous early warning signs in Zimbabwe, the communities themselves and chiefs of communities were like, this, we just don't understand, like, why is someone funding this?
Yeah.
So why? And again, that is a privileged position to be in, and there's issues around what you contribute. But I think you have to, I think all of this really has led us to, you have to be uncomfortable and be okay sitting with that, I think.
Yeah. And I think that's the key message I've got from the conversation that we've had, is that actually to advance your thinking in this space, you have to be comfortable with the uncomfortable. You need to have those uncomfortable conversations, because the conversation around impact and ethics ties into so many wider narratives that are currently happening, which I think are all positive, but which aren't always which are not easy by their very nature. They're not easy conversations to have. I mean, I found the whole conversation around, the challenging of the ref, both something empowering and uncomfortable at the same time, right?
Yeah.
because it sits in a funny space for me. But I think in terms of how you apply this to your practice, your impact and your engagement practice, I think what I am hearing from you, and I, bearing in mind that you come from a humanities discipline, and I wonder how this conversation would work if I was chatting to a STEM scientist or to an engineer. Not that I don't think these topics apply to them, but I think their approach to them and how they go about them would be slightly different. And maybe that's a challenge to myself. Maybe I should have this conversation with a STEM scientist, right? There should be a follow-up to this, in which we explore these topics in from a different disciplinary perspective, and to see how they go. But I mean, I think that for me, what I have got from this chat with you is just that it's fine to feel uncomfortable with these things, but the important thing is that you start thinking about them, right?
Yeah.
That's the main thing,
I think so.
You start thinking about them, and that the application of ethics to your impact and engagement practice becomes as expected as your application to this as part of your sort of research activity.
Yeah, I think so. And I think I've certainly encountered people. I've worked as the only social scientist on a project with engineers and in Malawi, actually. And whilst we were sitting having dinner in the evenings, I couldn't help but end up talking about all of it. And that was just completely new to them. And it's often positioned as overthinking, thinking too much, and sometimes I have to question myself, am I? But really, when it comes down to it, I don't think you can think too much about the ethics of what you're doing. If you're working with people and the environment, and perhaps for some people, animals, I think this is an important one, and it comes down, I think, to you being honest and transparent with other people and with yourself.
But also, I think accepting that there's always going to be a tension.
Yeah.
That going back to the example you gave around sustainability, that you think about environmental sustainability, but you need to balance that against the fact that to do what you want to do, you have to fly to Zimbabwe, because that's the only way to foster those relationships. So, there will always be that tension as well. There's never going to be, I think, a set of perfect answers to this. It is always going to be about being reflexive in one's practice, in knowing that you have, I guess, try to approach this in the least harmful way that you can, in the best way that you can, right? Is what that's about.
It's the fundamental principle, I suppose, of ethics,
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, well, thank you very much, Ashley. It has been really fascinating talking to you, as I knew it would be. And I hope others have also found it fascinating that are listening to this, even if We haven't given you a neat set of answers. I hope you're clear that there isn't a neat set of answers. And what we'd like you to do is to take some of the topics and the conversation pieces that were raised here and just take them away with you and kind of mull them over. If you're sat on a beach, it's the start of the summer holidays in July, and just reflect on them. I think that's all I would expect in terms of the impact of this podcast. Other people to reflect. Okay. Thank you.